If you've dabbled in anything video related, you've probably dealt with noise, the static that finds its way into every shot. So, how do you deal with noise, and where does it even come from? Let's start with the basics of how camera sensors capture images. Imagine a steady stream of photons hitting your sensor. Each pixel on your sensor has a photodiode, which generates an electrical signal proportional to the amount of photons it absorbs. More photons equals a stronger electrical signal, which then determines the brightness value at that pixel. However, the stream of photons isn't actually steady. Due to the nature of quantum mechanics, photons are emitted from their source with an inherent randomness. This causes small variations in the number of photons each pixel absorbs. This causes fluctuations in brightness values across pixels. This is called shot or photon noise and is the root cause of noise in our images. Something interesting happens when you look at the fluctuations compared to the number of photons collected. If you collect a lot of photons, the differences between pixels will be quite small. However, the fewer photons you collect, the greater the fluctuations will be. This is a fundamental property of probability called the law of large numbers, which states that the fluctuations from the average decrease as the sample size increases. Take rolling a die. You only converge to the average value of 3.5 as you roll continuously. In camera sensors, we're converging to an average rate of photons hitting each pixel. Understanding the underlying cause of shot noise is useful, however, it points to a much broader guiding principle that shows up everywhere noise appears: the signal-to-noise ratio. Imagine you're at the beach. The birds, waves, and breeze all exist as background noise. If your friends are talking quietly behind you, it'll be hard to hear them over the ocean. But if they come closer, it'll be easier to hear them.
That you can push yourself, but you gotta have brakes. And even if it seems like it's all over, like you're done or something, it's not really over until you say it's over.
This is because the relative loudness of the talking compared to the ocean increases. This is going from a low to a high signal-to-noise ratio. Now, what the signal-to-noise ratio tells us is that higher ratios will make it easier to discern the signal from the noise. In cameras, we find the signal-to-noise ratio equals the square root of the signal strength. This means to increase the signal-to-noise ratio, we need to increase the signal strength. This is done by letting in more light, which we can do in 3 different ways. Shoot in a brighter environment, increase the aperture, or decrease the shutter speed / increase the shutter angle. Now, you probably heard of the ISO setting on your camera, but what does it actually do? One of the biggest misconceptions about ISO is that it causes noise, which it doesn't. It only amplifies noise. ISO is simply a standard for defining your camera's sensitivity to light, defined by the International Organization for Standardization, where it gets its name from. This is a diagram of how a camera processes a signal and where noise originates at each step. You have shot noise, then upstream / front-end read noise that gets introduced as the sensor turns the incoming light into a signal. This signal is at the camera's native ISO, which is the native sensitivity to light of the camera. If you increase the ISO setting above the base ISO, the signal will be amplified. Finally, you have downstream / back-end read noise, which happens during the process of converting the analog electrical signal into a digital signal. Importantly, this final step happens after the analog amplification from increasing the ISO. The specific properties of a camera circuitry define which of the 3 families of ISO that camera falls into. Those families being ISO Variant, ISO Invariant, and Dual Native ISO. The first being ISO Variant. Older cameras typically had much higher levels of downstream read noise. This meant if you shot underexposed in camera by using a lower ISO, and then raised the exposure in post, you'd be amplifying the downstream read noise. Whereas if you shot at the correct exposure in camera by using a high enough ISO value, and then didn't need to raise the exposure in post, you would avoid amplifying the downstream read noise. This is an example image where the images to the left of the rightmost were shot underexposed with a low ISO value, then had their exposure raised in post to compensate. As you can see, this causes a definite increase in noise. This is why with ISO variant cameras, it's best to shoot at the correct exposure in camera with whatever ISO value you need to avoid raising the exposure in post and amplifying the downstream read noise. Now comes the concept of ISO invariance. ISO invariance means you get the same result from raising the ISO in camera as raising the exposure in post. When we repeat the previous test with an ISO invariant camera, we see a consistent level of noise at all ISO values we shot the image at, as you can see here. This is only possible when the levels of downstream read noise are really low, so any amplification from raising the exposure in post isn't noticeable. Because of this, with ISO invariant cameras, it's fine to shoot with a lower ISO value and then raise the exposure in post. Finally, we have dual native ISO cameras. Dual native ISO cameras have two native sensitivities to light. How this is done is a closely guarded secret by camera companies and likely depends on the camera you're using. However, the core idea stays the same. You have a second higher native ISO that is designed to produce a cleaner, less noisy signal. When we test this, we see two distinct bands of noise, with a very noticeable increase in noise in the lower band on the right. In practice, this means it's best to use the higher native ISO in lower light environments, where you need that extra exposure boost. However, it's still best to use a lower native ISO in much brighter environments to avoid overexposing your image or clipping the highlights. So far, we've covered that luminance noise arises from the fluctuations in photons hitting each pixel on your sensor, leading to varying brightness values. But where does color noise come from? Well, it comes from the same source, it just exists as a byproduct of how sensors create color. Most sensors use what's called a Bayer filter. A Bayer filter is an arrangement of red, green, and blue pixels where each pixel in the sensor corresponds to a pixel in the final image. To avoid further confusion, I'll use the technical term photosites to refer to pixels on the sensor. Each photosite is sensitive to only one color, so the camera will get a value for the intensity of that color at that photosite, say red equals 100. Then the camera must interpolate the values of the other two colors at that photosite using neighboring photosites. The fluctuations due to shot noise will change the color at the current photosite and neighboring photosites due to the spillover from interpolation, all of which causes color noise. So far I've talked about the signal to noise ratios being the main cause of noise. However, I've also talked about amplifying noise, such as raising the exposure in post or through analog amplification in the camera circuit. But if you're boosting a signal, the signal to noise ratio should stay the same, since you're increasing the signal and the noise by the same amount. So why would this make noise more apparent? Well, the signal to noise ratio is all about the relative difference between the signal and noise levels. However, when boosting both the signal and noise levels, we're raising the noise floor too. This makes the noise have a stronger presence. Now there's another key way post-production can make noise more visible: contrast. Going back to the beginning, noise is really just brightness fluctuations in your image. If we apply a noise effect to a gray image and increase the contrast, we see the strength/difference between pixels is increasing, causing the fluctuation/noise to increase. Now, increasing contrast this way often makes noise less visible, since we are pushing much of the shadow region towards pure black, effectively decreasing contrast in that region. This idea points to a different, more useful idea, which is decreasing contrast to decrease noise. S-curves are a great example of this. They increase contrast in the midtones, but decrease contrast in the shadows and highlights. The decrease in contrast in those regions decreases the differences due to noise, which makes noise less visible in those regions. This means S-curves are a great way to reduce noise in the shadows, however they will make noise more apparent in the midtones, which is where they increase contrast. So generally we can decrease luminance noise by decreasing the contrast. We can also decrease color noise by decreasing the saturation, which is effectively the color contrast. Now we're going to bring in what we learned into shooting a log profile. One of the main advantages of shooting in log or raw is increased dynamic range. This means they capture much more of the shadow and highlight region that would otherwise be clipped. A consequence of this is capturing much of the very low signal to noise ratio shadow region that would normally get clipped when using a standard picture profile. However, once you convert log to a standard color space, through color space transforms or LUTs, the shadow region gets pushed down a lot and much of it gets clipped to pure black, making the once very visible noise much less apparent. Here I have some footage to demonstrate this with. Adding color space transforms darkens the image and reduces the noise. Now, if we increase the exposure afterwards so the shadows aren't completely crushed, we reveal the noise we just hid. So, one way you can use this idea of compression to your advantage is by bringing up the general brightness of the shadows while compressing them. I have a node that does this, and you can see the noise looks better as the contrast decreases, even though the darkest parts of the image were brought up in exposure, which you can see in the waveform. Another way to do this is to compress the shadows while generally bringing the brightness values down. This results in a much darker looking image, but is substantially cleaner, because the noise is much harder to see. The result is the noise looking better because the shadows are so compressed. This looks less noisy than compressing the shadows while bringing them up, at the expense of everything being harder to see. Both options are valid ways to decrease noise in the shadows. The second is arguably the most common. When you look at clean footage shot at night, the shadows are usually dark and compressed, which is an easy way to clean up footage in post while still having it look natural. You can also clip the shadows in camera or in post to remove noise, because the fluctuations in the darkest parts of the shadow region will all get clipped to pure black. That's the basics behind the science of noise and how to use that knowledge to your advantage. For your convenience, there's a summary of practical recommendations in the description, along with timestamp notes that I didn't have time to cover, and further readings. So please go through those if you're confused on any points, or just want to learn more. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay nerdy.